Okay guys, this presentation here describes our workflow, our design process for assignment 3. The objective of this is to explain the process that we're about to undertake, the rationale behind following a design process, and also to give you some outline for the kind of research that you might need to undertake to design your site. So this is the kind of process that we will follow in order to design the site. You can see that here are a number of stages. Firstly, we need to start off generating some ideas. And the whole idea really is that we move from the idea generation aspect of this, which is fairly abstract, and as we move through this process we should end up with it at the end of the information architecture stage with a fairly concrete idea of what we're going to be building, and potentially we could give a document to somebody else based on our work and they should be able to build this for us and come out with something that represents our idea of how the site should be built. So we would generally start off with some brainstorming activities. The way I like to try and approach this, and this is by no means a definitive process, this is something that generally through experience people come up with their own workflow, would start off with some kind of outline description as to what we want the site to do, how we want it to appear, what it's all about essentially. Then I would tend to start to try and refine some of my ideas. So I would start with trying to come up with some words that I think describe the site, and this may be less about subject matter but more perhaps about spirit, ethos. Again, it's still fairly loose, but I might be looking at things such as sophistication, elegance, or grungy, urban, that kind of thing. Once I've done that, those words would inform then the next sort of exercise whereby I'd start to try and build a mood board, and that really just should serve as inspiration. So we'd start to collect things that we've seen, fonts, colours, images that we think relate to that description that you started off with and the 5 words. And beyond that we then go and start to try and put our ideas down on paper, and often I find that this first phase is very much a paper-based exercise. So we might create a mind map which again explores aspects of functionality, the kind of features that we want on there, and this is very much a wish list, not necessarily a final set, but to try and get down as many ideas as possible that we can then start to refine as we move through the stages. Stage 2 requirements. This is where we look at what our users would be expecting to get from this, and this is a question of knowing your audience. So that's related very much to subject matter, and so the audience for somebody who is looking at a gaming site is going to be very different to the audience for someone who is looking at, say, a site about accountancy. And so with that respect we need to consider what our users might be looking for, and here we would start to try and compile some kind of checklist so that when we get to the end of the design process we can look back at this checklist and see whether or not our design ticks all of the boxes. And the same is true for our client. What is it that our client wants to get from this? In the end, the client is the person potentially who is paying for this, and so the client needs to get from your design exactly what he's expecting. There are other things that we need to consider. So we may have a project brief or specification, and certainly as far as assignment 3 is concerned you would have one of those, and we might also need to think about some of the devices or browsers that might be looking on this site. So we can't control everything, but we can certainly take a lot of things into account, so that's something else for you to consider. Stage 3, this is where we start to really flesh out what our site is going to do, and as you have a look at the specification, obviously you will realize that what we are producing here is a content management system of some description. Now I'm not particularly bothered whether or not you have this database backend or text file, but it must be a content management system. And by that I mean we have a set of templates and the content itself is extracted from a data source. We need to think about the kind of things that our site can do. So in order to meet the requirements of the specification, we are going to need to have a login system. We will need to be able to upload text files, edit those text files, collect information about our users using both the client-side and server-side scripting, have some kind of error logs, generate statistics about our visitors, and to that end you'll need to produce things such as flow diagrams for any scripts that you use and navigation diagrams. Once we've got out what we want our site to do in terms of how it operates, we need to consider the next stage, which is how it looks and its feel. Again, this is quite a subjective thing, but again this will be based upon our users' requirements and also the ideas that we generated to start with. So again, your 5 words and your mood board could be very useful here. So again, we need to consider the kind of images that we're going to use, what our buttons are going to be like, and we really need to consider quite closely how we're going to design those. Storyboarding and wireframing, essentially the same thing. This will again lay out or consider how our site should be laid out, and a good idea here is to have a look at what other people do in the same kind of subject area, see what they're doing, see what they're doing right and wrong. And we need to consider a colour scheme, because ultimately we're going to build some style sheets for our site. Finally, information architecture, so that's the content itself, how we are going to mark up our content, and of course the age-old problem of making sure people can see it, so we're going to try and optimize our content to work with search engines. So why do we have a design workflow? Essentially, design is a discipline. If we're doing the same thing the same way every time, then we'll always know how far we are in the process. Often having a workflow is pretty much all you need. There is the old adage, fail to plan, plan to fail, and unfortunately many projects fall over or go off track simply because there is no clear plan in place. That's not to say that your plan can't change, but when we start off we often have lots and lots of different ideas, and those ideas sort of have to be kept within a certain scope based on the constraints of time and money, etc. So having a plan about when things need to be delivered by, when you need to make decisions, that's often a good thing. And planning lets you examine your ideas before you actually build it. That's much easier to change and amend rather than a product that you've already built, which may not necessarily match any requirements. And so we need to consider some research, and you need to develop an understanding of what your audience is looking for, obviously your client, what they're looking for, and the methods by which you can communicate a consistent message. So I have got a number of different pieces of content that will enable you to undertake that research, and it's important that you include that within your planning materials that you will put together as evidence of planning and design when you submit assignment 3. So what could we look at? Psychology of colour, different layouts, the relationship between content, negative space, all of these things are relevant to your design. As I was talking about, competitor analysis, what other companies do well, what they do poorly, and this gap between what they do well and what they do poorly represents often an opportunity to make a difference for your site. We're looking at producing working code first. Don't worry about optimizing things too early. Let's get things working first, and then once we have got everything working the way that we like, we've got a baseline operating product, and then we can worry about optimization after that. So that's assignment 3 in a nutshell. There are some following resources that will enable you to go through this process on Moodle, and as usual, if you've got any questions, drop me an email. Thanks.